I hope all you are fine. So today we are live now, and I will discuss of MEG 6 Block 4 Unit 2 American Prose in the period of national consolidation. Already Unit 1 I have discussed in my earlier videos. You can go through my earlier videos and you will get all notification by pushing the bell icon. Okay, so we will start today. So Unit 2 American Prose in the period of national consolidation. So we will start. Here the structure, here is the objectives, then introduction, the literature of constitutional controversies and constitutional confirmation, letters of the early republic, the prose of American Romanticism 1, the prose of American Romanticism 2, let us sum up, glossary, questions and suggested readings. So before we start the objectives, I will request to you all, please like, share and subscribe Study with Master Notes and share it with your friends, so you will get my upcoming videos and you will get all notifications about my videos, and it will help you in your study of PG or MA in education or English and your NET exam also. Okay, so we will start. Here it is the objectives. So every unit has its objectives. So here it is the objectives. We will clearly study what is the objectives of revolutionary American prose in the period of national consolidation. Okay, here it is the American prose in the period of national consolidation. So here it is the objectives. The aim of this unit will be to study American prose writing of the period of national consolidation, stretching roughly over the last quarter of 18th century and the first quarter of the 19th century and somewhat further through the years of Andrew Jackson's presidency 1828 to 1836 into the era of erosion of nationalist sentiment, which then inevitably led to the Civil War. The prose writing studied in this unit will include essays and articles on the draft constitution of 1787 as well as on the constitution after it was formally enacted and enshrined into law, notably the Federalist Papers in the former category and the Bill of Rights in the latter category. Constitutional literature apart, the unit will focus upon prose writings of other kinds produced especially during the period 1790 to 1820, articles in journals and magazines, criticism and epistles. Some of these prose writings anticipated that era of great flowering of American prose writing, the so-called American Renaissance, which featured most prominently the literature of the transcendentalist thinkers. The unit will conclude with an examination of this literature. So here it is the main key point. You can note down some of these prose writings anticipated that era of great flowering of American prose writing, the so-called American Renaissance. So here it is, we will study the American Renaissance period of American literature, which featured most prominently the literature of the transcendentalist thinkers. Okay, here it is the introduction. The literature of constitutional controversies and constitutional confirmation. With the draft constitution ready, the movement for its ratification arrived, requiring a vote in state conventions, with approval of 9 out of the 13 states essential to ratify it. In New York, where engagement with ratification was intense, a series of newspaper pieces appeared anonymously and they tell us much about the nature of the Constitution. These pieces, 85 in number, favoring adoption of the Constitution, were written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, and came to be known as Federalist Papers. Opponents of the Constitution became known as Anti-Federalist, written under the pen name of Publius. The legendary statements of classical Rome, the Federalist write from Federalist number 1, promises a lesson of moderation to those who are ever so much persuaded of their being in the right in any controversy, dismissing the torrent of angry and malignant passions, the bitterness and the specious mask of zeal for the rights of the people of his enemies. Publius assumes for himself the evidence of truth and the high moral ground of a judicious estimate of our true interest, unperplexed and unbiased by considerations not connected with the public good. Okay, so here it is the main key point you can note down. Okay, for Publius assumptions. Okay, so here you can note down what is Publius assumptions. So Publius assumes, okay, Publius assumes for himself the evidence of truth and the high moral ground of a judicious estimate of our true interest, unperplexed and unbiased by consideration not connected with the public good. Here it is the Publius assumptions. Then the same high moral ground that the narrator assumes for himself, he also arrogates to the institution of representative government. In Federalist number 10, he thus argues that representative government is needed to maintain peace in a society ridden by factional disputes. These disputes came from the various and unequal distribution of property. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interest in society. The problem, according to him, in how to control the factional struggles that come from inequalities in wealth. Minority fractions can be controlled, he says, by the principle that decisions will be by the vote of the majority. So the real problem, according to the narrator, is the majority fraction. And here the solution is offered by the constitution to have an extensive republic, that is a large nation ranging over 13 states, for then it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other. The influence of factious leaders may kindle a flame within their particular states, but will be unable to spread a general conflagration through the other states. This argument can be seen as sensible argument for having a government which can maintain order and avoid disorder. What is the aim? But is it the aim of government simply to sustain truce as a referee between two equality matched fighters? Or is the truce to be sustained only as status quo, a certain distribution of power and wealth which the government seeks to preserve? In that case, the avoidance of disorder and the maintenance of order on the part of the government becomes a class biased rather than a class neutral venture. This interpretation makes sense when one looks at the economic interest and the social backgrounds of the makers of the constitution. Okay, so this interpretation makes sense when one looks at the economic interest and the social backgrounds of the makers of the constitution. As part of this his argument for a large republic to keep the peace, the narrator tells quite clearly in Federalist number 10 whose peace he wants to keep: a raise of paper money, for an abolition of debts, for an equal division of property, or for any other improper or wicked project will be less apt to prevent the whole body of the union than a particular member of it. When economic interest and social backgrounds are seen behind the political clauses of the constitution, then the constitution becomes not simply the certain creation of liberal democratic authors trying to establish an enlightened society based on the principles of fraternity and equality, but the production of certain social groups trying to maintain their privileges while conceding just enough rights to enough of the people to ensure popular support. Elsewhere in the Federalist Papers, the narrator writes even more explicitly that the new union will be able to repress domestic faction and insurrection. He refers directly to the Say's Rebellion, named after farmer leader Daniel Say's, a militant anti-state demonstration organized in 1780 in Springfield, Massachusetts, by more than 700 armed farmers, most of them veterans of the American Revolution, against the Massachusetts legislature's refusal to issue paper money, as had been done in some other states like Rhode Island. to make it easier for debt-ridden farmers to pay off their creditors. The tempestuous situation from which Massachusetts has scarcely emerged evinces that dangers of this kind are not merely speculative. The Say's rebellion is cited as an example of the temporary errors and delusions, which, according to the narrator of the Federalist Papers, sometimes afflicts the people, and against which is required to quote from Federalist number 63 the interference of some temperate and respectable body of citizens in order to check the misguided career and to suspend the blow meditated by the people against themselves, until reason, justice, and truth can regain their authority over the public mind. Then, in the opinion of the narrator of the Federalist Papers, the Constitution of the United States itself represents the safeguard of sober judgment against any potential or actual assault on the stability of the Republic. Yet this opinion needs to be offset by an alternative view articulated by Charles Baird, which argues that all constitutions are intended to legitimize the governments that enacted them, and by extension the vested interest of power and wealth which run these governments. Yet this opinion needs to be offset by an alternative view articulated by Charles Baird, which argues that all constitutions are intended to legitimize the governments that enact them, and by extension the vested interest of power and wealth which run these governments. Charles Baird, which argues that all constitutions are intended to legitimize the governments that enact them, by extension the vested interest of power and wealth which run these governments. Vested interest of power and wealth which run these governments. Nevertheless, when the United States Constitution was finally ratified, it did have the support of much more than merely an elite minority of the United States population. Thus, it was not just the 3% of the population who had large holdings of property, but nearly 33% of the population who were small farmers, and an even bigger percentage who were city working men, who more or less supported the United States Constitution. The Constitution then, as Howard Zinn has analyzed, illustrates the complexity of the American system, that it serves the interest of a wealthy elite but also does enough for small property owners, for middle income mechanics and farmers to build a broad base of support. The slightly prosperous people who make up this base of support are buffers against the blacks, the Indians, the very poor whites. They enable the elite to keep control with a minimum of coercion, a maximum of law, all made palatable by the fanfare of patriotism and unity. There were several strategies whereby the Constitution of the United States built up its broad base of support among the slightly prosperous people. The rhetoric of the popular participation was employed liberally right from the moment Washington wrote the letter delivering the Constitution to the Congress on behalf of the Constitutional Convention, sent by unanimous order of the Convention on September 17, 1787. The letter uses the undifferentiated first personal plural pronoun to assimilate every level of difference. In all our deliberations on this subject, differences among the several states, we kept steadily in our view that which appears to us the greatest interest of every true American, the consolidation of our Union. The litany of first person plural pronouns in the possessive case conflates and confuses constitution maker and ordinary citizen. So here it is the main key point you can note down. The litany of first person plural pronouns in the possessive case conflates and confuses constitution maker and ordinary citizen. Our deliberations and our view referring to the constitution maker's perspective but merging with our union, the perspective of every true American. Washington then alludes to differences that might have been anticipated but that never did actualize. Again, the particular decorum of the farmers as gentlemen is also the general decorum of the true American perspective. In Washington's words, the Constitution which we now present is the result of a spirit of amity. Those who disagree must remember that the document emerged out of mutual difference and concession, and that it therefore is liable to as a few exceptions as could reasonably have been expected. The expected exceptions apart, any challenge to any part of the document violates the decorum of consent and consensus, forgets the greatest interest of every American, and endangers our prosperity, felicity, safety, perhaps our national existence. These words follow the tactic of coercion already traced in the preamble of the Constitution. We the people of the United States, etc., etc., and the prefigure of the Constitution makers endless strategy in the ratification debates. The people of the United States ostensibly share the Constitution makers' act of writing through the related act of ratification. Thus, a Robert A. Ferguson has argued agreement with the document looms as the acceptable interpretation of it. The evolution of these strategies is evident in the pre-ratification debates. At some point in the rearrangement of 23 loose items into the 10 tight articles of final version, the text of the Constitution is close to interpretation and reinterpretation. Amendments on the Constitution, it is made clear, are to be made as being part of or in extension to its main text, which is thereby declared as beyond alteration. Amendments to the Constitution, instigated largely by the anti-federalist, more populist than the federalist with their elitist orientation, takes the form of a Bill of Rights comprising 10 clauses to begin with. But the Bill of Rights, safeguarding the liberal democratic freedoms of speech, writing, religion, self-defense and trial by jury, are only added onto the Constitution that remains intact despite every amendment. Indeed, the first 10 amendments effectively freeze up the primary document when they are endorsed and enshrined in the text in the 1791. They ensure that all further changes will be supplementary rather than integral to the language of the Constitution makers. The Constitution makers were quick to realize that the Bill of Rights strengthened the government. As Madison observed, it gave to the government its due popularity and stability. The Bill of Rights, plain and proper, and like the Constitution itself, discouraging interpretations, therefore got through with much less ado than might have been imagined. Each of these first 10 amendments is a single sentence, with the longest employing 106 words and the shortcuts just 16. 5 amendments are 30 words or less. Brevity quite clearly is deemed to be the soul of consensus. Then letters of the early republic. From 1790 to 1820, there was not a book, a speech, a conversation, or a thought in the state. So wrote Ralph Waldo Emerson in 1852 about what he considered the cultural blankness of the early republic, specifically with reference to New England. Until the 1980s, academic criticism accepted and elaborated this denigrating judgment on post-revolutionary literature. To most readers, there seemed little to admire in the efforts of the early republic apart from its public documents. The assessments has now been revised as new interest in the writing of the early republic has brought fuller appreciation of the writings, purposes and character, but nonetheless it is necessary to analyze the reasons for the endemic neglect of post-revolutionary culture. The tradition of writing, inaugurated in the mid-19th century, emerged gradually into a hegemonic prominence as the writings of American Renaissance. The canonical status earned by Emerson and his contemporaries of 1830s and the 1840s necessarily sidelined art that was not imaginative, that is, art as religious, moral and ethical forms of discourse. These authors refused to see literature role as instructional, as influencing readers, towards the direction of better citizenship or of conscientious behavior. This canonical artist strove for a unique voice that communicated the author's extraordinary personality through words which were intended to express his or her quest for self-realization. Corresponding to the unique voice of the artist was a conception of the literary career as a distinct vocation. The author aspired to be a professional, someone who entered into the contemplation with other authors for money and fame. Authorship was assumed to be a full-time activity not confined to moments stolen from responsibility as ministers, administrators, and politicians. The distinct traits of mid-19th century writing were not too much in evidence in the letters of the early republic. Early republican letters did not invariably anticipate the American Renaissance tradition. In exploring post-revolutionary literature, it is important to remember the edits of authors themselves for whom art for art's sake was always subordinate to art for life's sake. Rigidly aesthetic category as set by literary canon, which came up later, gave limited recognition to an array of writings inspired by utility. The insistent presence of a non-aesthetic elements in these writings perhaps best explains their devolution in relation to a canonical literature defined by aesthetic considerations. Post-revolutionary American literature was the product of historical formation dominated by republicanism. Republicanism, the governing ideology of revolutionary era, regarded one's highest calling as participation in the public realm. Republicans understood good conduct as the affirmation of public obligations over private opportunities. Benjamin Ross, a signer of Declaration of Independence, declared that every young man in a republic must be taught that he does not belong to himself, but that he is public property. The citizens' energies, nay more life, belongs to this country. So overpowering was the Republican insistence on service before self that it even submerged Republicanism's idealization of economic independence. Prevailing economic realities encouraged these ideological inclinations. Post-revolutionary United States was centered on production within the home. The great majority of people lived on farms and supported themselves by their own labor. They enjoyed a measure of self-sufficiency in food and in clothing. The underdeveloped condition of transport tended to restrict commercial transactions within local areas and to inhibit the establishment of extended market networks. In rural areas, exchange retained on orientation towards utility. Farmers swapped produce and services and often carried on business without the mediation of cash. Customary arrangements and obligations remained paramount. Local autonomy, allegiance to family investments rather than to individual fulfillment, the social valuation of economic activity defined the day-to-day world of most Americans. The letters of the early republic reproduced these conditions to a considerable extent. So here it is the main key point you can note down. Customary arrangements and obligations remain paramount. Local autonomy, allegiance to family investments rather than to individual fulfillment, and social valuation of economic activity define the day-to-day world of most Americans. The letters of the early republic reproduced this condition to a considerable extent. Literary narratives were never viewed as the personal possession of the authors, even by the authors themselves, who never made any claims for the distinctive individuality of their creations. Narratives were common property or public knowledge, and even the appearance of a story in someone else's novel did not preclude its being recycled in a later work of fiction. On the contrary, the familiarity of a taste seems to have been in its favor, just as lack of recognition and could earn it discredit. The point can be grasped by glancing at two of the era's most important fictions, Will Hill Brown's The Power of Sympathy, published in 1789 and usually designated the first American novel, and the Hannah Foster's The Coquette, which appeared in 1797. So here it is the main key point you can note down. The point can be grasped by glancing at two of the era's most important fictions, Will Hill Brown's The Power of Sympathy. Okay, so Will Hill Brown's The Power of Sympathy, published in 1789, usually designated the first American novel, and Hannah Foster's The Coquette, okay, which appeared in 1797. Will Hill Brown's The Power of Sympathy, again I am continuing, the Hannah Foster's The Coquette in 1797 is the powerful novel at that time, 1789 and 1797. Both books, in the manner typical of the early novel, present themselves as founded on actual events. Both play down the role of the imagination in their making. Both insist upon their practical value as moral instruction and warn against the dangers of reading novels. Paralleling its main seduction plot, Brown's tale contains several interpolated narratives, at least two of which have been shown to be closely patterned or contemporaneous incidents. One, the story of Ophelia and Mr. Martin, which is related in letters 21 through 23, was inspired by the tragic love affair of Perez Morton, a well-connected Bostonian, and his sister-in-law, Frances Apthorpe, who committed suicide. The episode was public knowledge at the time Brown wrote his novel. A second nested narrative on the evils of seduction appears as a long footnote to letter 11 and concerns Elizabeth Whitman, a Connecticut woman who is identified by name and whose death has been reported only 6 months earlier in newspaper obituary notices. This episode, who provided the basis for Foster's The Coquette, where the historical Elizabeth Whitman resurfaces as the imaginary Eliza Wharton. The actually oriented corporate ownership view of narrative, often struggling to contain more inventive elements, appeared everywhere in the letters of the early republic. In poetry, epic-like recitations of patriotic accomplishments abounded. Joseph Brown Lad's The Prospect of America, printed in his poem of Arrowhead 1786, celebrates military exploits from the war with Britain and memorializes heroic officers by name. Public figures and events provided constant inspiration also for the drama. From Mercy Otis Warren's satirical farce, The Adulterer 1773, which deals with the Boston Massacre, through William Dunlap's historical tragedy Andrew 1798, in which George Washington appears as a character along with the British spy he ordered hanged, to a half-dozen plays about American troubles with the Barbary pirates, among them Susanna Rowson's Slaves in Algiers 1794 and Mordecai M. Noah's The Siege of Tripoli 1820. Okay, the non-originary inclination of the writing of the early republic was bolstered by the emphatic proximity of English literature. About 3/4 of the books published in the United States before 1820 were the English origin. Combined with the absence of the international copyright law, the availability of so many renowned authors in a common tongue created an irresistible temptation to adapt and to imitate, and dampened the ambition to cultivate an individual voice. So, okay, United States 1820. So, here about 3/4 of the books published in United States before 1820 were the English origin. Combined with the absence of the international copyright law, combined with the absence of an international copyright law, the availability of so many renowned authors in a common tongue created an irresistible temptation to adapt and to imitate and dampen the ambition of cultivate an individual voice. So at that time there is absence of copyright law. You can note down in your notebook. James Kirke Paulding, one half facetiously, complained that in some genres foreign competition entirely stifled native endeavour. Were it not for Shakespeare, Milton, Newton, Locke, Bacon, Professor Porson, and a few more illustrious English dramatic writers, the theatres in this country could not exist. Shakespeare's Tom and Jerry is played over and over again night and night, and Bacon's abridgment as often, if not oftener. So Shakespeare's Tom and Jerry is played over and over again, night and night, and Bacon's abridgment as often, if not oftener. Not only in imaginative writings but in journalistic writings as well, English paradigms influenced American production. Early periodicals in America as in England evolved out of newspapers and were often indistinguishable from them, or lineages that contested the segregation of aesthetic matters from mundane activities. American newspapers were an important outlet for cultural production. They welcomed poetry, literary essays, and vignettes. American newspapers were an important outlet for cultural production. They welcomed poetry, literary essays, and vignettes, and their format frequently effaced the division between the everyday and extraordinary. Thus, the twice weekly Gazette of the United States included in its edition for May 28, 1791, a poem, Laura and Mary, about a coquette whose spurned lover drowns himself, an ode to reviewers, and a piece on English naval architecture, all jostling for space with dispatches from abroad, reports on commerce and politics, and list of prices current for public securities. Some papers, more sensitive to generic differentiation, confined their cultural miscellany to the last page under headings such as Seat of the Muses, Poetry Corner, The Repository of Genius, the famous Weekly Museum of Walpole, New Hampshire, which Denny edited during the 1790s, treated readers to a last page called The Desert. Besides printing poems and essays, including Denny's celebrated lay preacher series, a subsection titled Notes contained just curious anecdotes and fables from Aesop. Like many other newspapers, the famous Weekly Museum was really a hybrid. Its literary content had so prominent a place that publisher described it as magazine in a minor form. The term magazine implies a repository or storehouse, and early American magazines inevitably had an encyclopedic and eclectic quality that persisted into the 19th century. The contents of American magazines, therefore reflecting the medium newspaper origins, showed a diversity that transcended the boundaries of gentlemanly ethos. Many journals, including some of the most prestigious, published articles and short stories holding unconventional opinions. Efforts were made to enlarge the leadership to incorporate every class. In the phrase of the New York Magazine or literary repository, Amelia or the Faithless Briton, An American Tale 1787, a narrative of seduction published in the Columbian Magazine of Philadelphia, was one of numerous sentimental fictions that appeared in periodicals and were aimed at a wide audience. The story, whose author is unknown, portrays the despoiler of innocence as a British officer. Other stories appeal to native interest by taking economic opportunity as their subject, but the majority of the tales were pirated from English publications and exposed their parentage. Several, for instance, deal with the evils of primogeniture. Magazines were eager to cultivate female readers also. Articles celebrated female accomplishments, argued for the importance of well-informed nationalist mothers who served the country by raising well-inspired sons. The journals became vocal supporters of female education and occasionally of female equality. The prose of American Romanticism. By the rude breeze that arched the flood, their flag to April breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmer stood and fired the shot heard round the world. Ralph Waldo Emerson in Concord Ham. The portrait of Ralph Waldo Emerson, the poet and essayist, lived most of his adult life in Concord. The democratization of American culture, suggested by the evolution of American periodical literature, expressed itself fully during the Romantic period in America. Otherwise also called the period of first person singular. Ralph Waldo Emerson, who designed the period, thus described it in following words: "There is a moment in the history of every nation when, proceeding out of his brute youth, the perceptive powers reach their ripeness and have not yet become microscopic, so that man at that instant extends across the entire scale, and with his feet still planted on the immense forces of night, converses with his eyes and brain with solar and stellar creation. This is the moment of adult health and culmination of power. The moment of America's coming into its own cultural entity, called American Renaissance by F.O. Matheson and American Nations by Richard Ruland and Malcolm Bradbury, was especially a New England movement, though Herman Melville and Walt Whitman from the state of New York and Edgar Allan Poe from South contributed to its making. From 1790 to 1820, there was not a book, a speech, a conversation, or a thought in the state. Emerson said of Massachusetts in his journals about 1820, thus Channing, Webster, and Everett era began, and we have been bookish and poetical and cogitative since. This is an exaggeration. Boston had never neglected the church or the university, its academics and its clerics. It had the North American Review from 1815, where arguments for a national literature raised. Cambridge across the river had Harvard and epitome of learning, and Bancroft and Parkinson, Motley and Ticknor, the leading historians. New England was the hub of reform, from temperance and feminism to anti-slavery, and was central in national politics. Its old Puritanism had been transformed above all by Unitarianism, which William Ellery Channing said sowed the soul is the spring of our knowledge of God, an assumption akin to Emerson's. Ralph Waldo Emerson's leading role has made the transcendentalism of which he was spokesman seem central, but perhaps it seems more so in retrospect that it did at the time. It was one of the many movements in the air at a point when sects and schisms, factions, and faiths stirred New England life and spread abroad to the nation. Utopianism, mesmerism, abolitionism, anything that, as Charles Dickens put it, looked a little beyond, suited the contemporary New England temper. To try to grasp the spirit of transcendentalism is by definition to try to grasp the ungraspable, which is precisely what transcendentalism should to do. What essentially guided his thinking was its descent from Unitarianism and the Lockean and Newtonian worldview, which attempt to understand the human subject and his or her negotiation of objective circumstances in mechanistic cause and effect terms. Transcendentalism challenged this worldview, which had persisted so powerfully into the American 19th century, though its celebration of individual self and his or her self-consciousness and its reassertion of an idealistic Neoplatonism that paradoxically drew it back again toward the Puritan tradition. Its thinking was fed by philosophers like Kant and Swedenborg, Coleridge and Carlyle, European romantics who asserted the power of the imagination, the soul as spirit illuminated by the divine. In what John Quincy Adams, the Republic's sixth president from 1824 to 1828, called New England's bubbling cauldron of religion and politics. So here it is the main key point you can note down. In 1824, John Quincy Adams, the Republic's sixth president, 1824 to 1828, called the New England's bubbling cauldron of religion and politics, in which innumerable isms were concocted daily. Transcendentalism spoke to the value of inward spiritual prompting and the need for a private relation between the self and the universe. On September 9, 1832, the Ralph Waldo Emerson, descended from a long line of New England ministers and himself the minister of the Second Unitarian Church in Boston, announced his skepticism about the Lord Super, resigned his ministry, and pledged himself to a personal, non-institutional form of faith. Very few could have known that a whole new era in the history of the American imagination was underway. At the end of that year, Emerson set sail for Europe in a state of mental crisis to reconsider his position. There he encountered the full force of European romantic, organicist thought in religion, philosophy, social opinion, politics, and aesthetics. Of that thought, we may firmly say he gave a creating misleading. After Emerson returned a year later, he settled well outside Boston in sleepy Concord, soon to become. Emerson set sail for Europe in a state of mental crisis to reconsider his position. There he encountered the full force of European romantic, organist through in religion, philosophy, social opinion, politics, and aesthetics. Of that thought, we may fairly say have a creative misreading. After Emerson returned a year later, he settled well outside Boston in sleepy Concord, soon to become a transcendentalism capital city. And he now declared himself in his first book, appropriately called Nature, 1836. Emerson's settlement of the innocent vision at work in natural world was meant as a new beginning for himself and all Americans, and that is what eventually came to seem. The body of B. Franklin Printer, like the cover of an old book, its contents torn out and script of its lettering and gilding, lies here food for worms, but the work shall not be lost, for it will, as he believed, appear once more in a new and more elegant edition, revised and corrected by the author Benjamin Franklin, his own epitaph written in 1728 at the beginning of his career. In its argument for a transformed relation between the self and material world, Nature was nothing less than a manifesto, serving notice that the Enlightenment tradition of William Bide II and Benjamin Franklin, what had become the Cobb's cold Unitarianism of Brattle Street and Harvard College, no longer lived. It had now to be challenged by the insistence that God had made material nature not as a mere commodity but as a hieroglyph of his spiritual world. Nature was not merely a challenge to man's powers of domination and exploitation. It spoke directly to the self, to the individual self-consciousness. To what end is nature? Emerson asked. He proposed that it was a scripture, more immediate, more edifying, and more accessible than any written statement, though it called for the scripter, the Orphic poet who responds to and incorporates its language. Even though he was quickly So the body of B. Franklin Printer, like the cover of an old book, it content torn out and spirit of its lettering and gliding, lies here food for worms, but the work shall not be lost. For it will, as he believed, appear once more in a new and more elegant edition, revised and corrected by the author Benjamin Franklin, his own epitaph written in 1728 at the beginning of his career. In its argument for a transformed relation between self and material world, Nature was nothing less than a manifesto serving notice that the Enlightenment tradition of William Bide II and Benjamin Franklin, what had become the Cobb's cold Unitarianism of Brattle Street and Harvard College, no longer lived. It had now to be challenged by the insistence that God had made material nature not as a mere commodity but as a hieroglyph of his spiritual world. Nature was not merely a challenge to man's powers of domination and exploitation. It spoke directly to the self, to the individual self-consciousness. To what end is nature? Emerson asked. He proposed that it was a scripture, more immediate, more edifying, and more accessible than any written statement, though it called for its scripter the Orphic poet who responds to and incorporates its language. Even though he was quickly denounced for his German insanity. Emerson's radiating conviction began to catch hold of his as he had known that it would. By 1838, Harriet Martineau was explaining to her fellow Britons that one could not really know America unless one knew Emerson. In him, one leading quality is to be distinguished, modest independence, independence equally of thought, speech, of demeanor, of occupation, and of objects in life. Emerson himself did not embrace what had originated as a derogatory label until his lecture, The Transcendentalist in 1841, that acknowledged the influence of Kant and asserted that the Transcendentalist believes in miracle, in the perpetual openness of the human mind to new influx of light and power. He believes in inspiration and in ecstasy. By then, this faith was already becoming a movement. From 1836, there was a Transcendentalist club that attracted many New England radical thinkers drawn by Emerson's faith in the self. Bronson Alcott, George Ripley, Augustus Bronson, Theodore Parker, Margaret Fuller, and Elizabeth Peabody, the would-be sister-in-law of Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was not quite willing to be co-opted into this fraternity. Independence was the live motive. In 1837, Emerson delivered his Phi Beta Kappa address at Harvard, the American Scholar. It memorably restarted the theme that we have listened too long to the courtly muses of Europe, and thereby it earned its place as America's declaration of literary independence. And it argued that the scholar in his right state is not simply a thinker but man thinking, an active voice of experience. The theme of independence was extended in Self-Reliance 1841, which expressed a central doctrine. A divinity existed intimately in several natural life forms in each organic entity. This was no appeal to the accusative self projected by many Enlightenment thinkers, not to the entrepreneurship of their busy commercial age. Emerson's self is ethically opposed to selfishness. His is a quest for the best self one can imagine to merge in ultimate union with the transcendental self, what he called characterizes the believer whose identity rests on foundations not for the society or of this world. Indeed, Emerson essays, lectures, and sermons, which came in great outpouring as he tortured the country and spoke his powerful message, can be read as a secularized version of the Jeremiad and millenarian utterance. The message that now lived alive from New England's bar rooms, lyceums, committee rooms to fill the world with their thunder, as Emerson put it, was in essence apocalyptic. In nature, Emerson was already denouncing the age of retrospective and announcing, there are new lands, new men, new thoughts. Let us demand our own works and laws and worship. In Representative Men 1850, he announced the moment of new power when man extends across the full scale. He took from his ministerial training the prophetic role and spoke in the voice of revelation about the infinitude of the private mind. The infinitude of the private mind, according to Emerson, is most evident in the case of the poet. Poetry opens up new epochs and new vistas in our consciousness. We are likely persons who come out of a cave or cellar into the open air, says Emerson. This is the effect on us of tropes, fables, oracles, and all poetic forms. Poets are thus liberating gods. They are in fact perceivers of a prior poem, the universe itself. The sea, the mountain range, Niagara, and every flower bed pre-exist in cantations which sail like odors in their air, and when many man goes by with an ear sufficiently fine, he overhears them and endeavors to write down the notes without diluting or depraving them. And herein is the legitimation of criticism in the mind's faith that the poems are a corrupt version of some taste in nature with which they ought to be made to tally. In Emerson's notion of art as taste and sacrament, that makes the place he holds in American literature between the Puritans with their providential allegory who preceded him and the symbolist designers of art who succeeded him. Emerson is a moral thinker and writer. He quests for fundamental truth, but he refuses to translate the world around him into a simple lexicon of one to one meanings. By distinguishing the fixed emblem, what he calls mysticism, from the fluid image, he opens the way to later authors from Herman Melville to Wallace Stevens. The prose of American Romanticism too. Emerson published The Poet in 1844. 1 year later, on July 4, the anniversary of national independence, Henry David Thoreau began the exercise in personal spiritual independence that led to Walden. 10 years later, Whitman published The Leaves of Grass. Each drew directly on Emerson's thought, and each dared to write his autobiography in colossal cipher or into university to express an America. Certainly, when Henry David Thoreau began building a cabin near Concord on Emerson's 14 acres at Walden Pond, many must have recalled Emerson's self-reliance. The Thoreau himself would see his 2 year adventure on the pond shore as a westward quest for the Emerson self. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live that what was not life. Living is so dear, nor did I wish to practice resignation, unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to live so steadily and Spartan like so as to put to rout all that was not life, to cut a broad swath and save close, to drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms. A lake is the landscape's most beautiful and expressive feature, its earth's eye, looking into which the beholder measures the depth of his own nature. Henry David Thoreau in Walden. The only one of the transcendentalists actually born in Concord, Thoreau, after a ministerial training, chose a life of what he called excursions, schoolteacher, surveyor, handyman, and student of nature. His writing was itself such an excursion, a journey to the center of life. As he put it, he travelled much in Concord. His journals, 14 volumes, 1906 posthumous, his letters and verses, articles and speeches, and his two published books, A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, 1849, and Walden, 1854, represent the epitome of Emersonian independence. Walden is an experience as well as description of one. It is the description rather than the experience that Thoreau offers to the readers of the book. The eye for the first page is as much Thoreau the artist, the Thoreau the activist. We look through the eye of the artist at the eye or eye of the activist, and beyond the pond which reflects the depths of the soul as much as the heights of the oversoul. The book Thoreau describes writing at Walden Pond was not Walden, but A Week on the Concord and Merrimack. He published this in 1849 in 1,000 copies, largely at his own expense. 4 years later, he was forced to undertake storage of remaining 706. I have now a library of nearly 900 volumes, over 700 which I wrote myself. It is not well that the author should behold the fruits of his labor. It has reasonably been be surmised that the failure of A Week generated the artistic complexity of Walden. In no position to publish, Thoreau went on reading sections of his new book to friends and rearranging passages to heighten their effect until publication became possible. Thus, in book that gradually took shape, imagination transformed experience into parable, or what Thoreau called scripture. Part of this transformative effect lies in the narrator's own persona, his assumption of the voice of a seer and sage. But equally important is the role assigned to the reader. Most implied readers are like the taste John Farmer, with commitments and compulsions which make their passage to the pond impossible. Yet by joining John Farmer in the appropriate purifying rituals and listening for the beckoning sound of the flute the Thoreau did play, the readers who as Thoreau disciples might some day visit Walden Pond. I claim to be altogether radical, that's my chief stock in trade. Take the radicalism out of the leaves. Do wo think anything worthwhile would be left? Walt Whitman, quoted by Horace L. Travel win with Walt Whitman in Camden. Photograph of Walt Whitman. Walden is not a place of total solitude. The railroad runs by its society is closed. Thoreau was not communitarian like George Ripley or Bronson Alcott, but he engaged the community, an abolitionist. He spoke out for John Brown, the anti-slavery radical. When the Mexican War burdened his conscience, he spent a night in jail rather than pay taxes for its support. His act became a symbolic statement. When asked why he was behind bars, Thoreau wondered why any decent person was outside supporting an unjust state. In another emblematic gesture, he declared his will to resign from all the institutions he could not remember having joined. The most durable impact Transcendentalism made on social action followed Thoreau's civil disobedience, 1849. It guided Mahatma Gandhi's campaign of passive resistance to British rule in India and the tactics of civil disobedience used in the United States itself against racial discrimination and Vietnam War in 1960s. So, the most durable impact Transcendentalism made on social action followed Thoreau's civil disobedience, 1849. It guided Mahatma Gandhi's campaign of passive resistance to British rule in India and the tactics of civil disobedience used in the United States itself against racial discrimination and the Vietnam War in 1960. But the Transcendentalist who was able to create an aesthetic out of the interaction between society and the individual was Walt Whitman. It is tempting to see Whitman, Thoreau, and Emerson as part of a single lineage. Emerson, the conceptualizer, Thoreau, the executive, the Whitman, the celebrator. But if this clarifies, it also simplifies, for each of these transcendentalists was truly his own. Emerson, despite his insistence that the word was real and not a signifier of abstractions, remained closest to philosophical idealism and the essentialism of Kant. Thoreau expressed a far more direct contact with the natural world and as also the world of fellow human beings, despite his stated aversion to the trappings of a materialist existence. Whitman always retained a transcendentalist spirituality, but the mysterious value of life lay finally in what he directly encountered through his senses. The empirical merges with the essential, and so his long continuous poem is centripetal as well as centrifugal, a convoluted yet comprehensive word book. He called it, whose omnivorous pages can encompass the leaves of grass and the leaves of blue books, permanence and mutability, the shifting progress of America from rural agriculture to urban industrial nation. Then let us sum up. In this unit, we have studied American prose writing of the period of national consolidation stretching roughly over the last quarter of the 18th century and the first quarter of the 19th century, and somewhat further through the years of Andrew Jackson's presidency 1828 to 1836 into the era of erosion of nationalist sentiment, which then inevitably led to the Civil War. The prose writing studied in this unit include essays and articles involving issues thrown up by the draft Constitution of 1787 as well as by the Constitution once it was formally enacted and enshrined into law. Constitutional literature apart, this unit has focused upon prose writings of other kinds produced especially during the period 1790 to 1820 in periodicals as criticism and as epistles. Some of these prose writings anticipated that era of great flowering of American prose writing, the so-called American Renaissance, which featured most prominently the literature of transcendentalist thinkers. The unit concludes with an examination of this literature. Then American Renaissance, term coined by F.O. Matheson as title for his seminal critical study of art and expression in the works of the 19th century United States authors, namely Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, and Walt Whitman. Matheson used in the term 1941 to denote what he and many others after him thought to be the founding founding movement of the American literary tradition in terms of the self-awareness and self-consciousness on the part of a generation of American, mostly male, white New England writers that they were establishing a literary tradition parallel to but distinct from English European literary traditions, a tradition devoted to use Matheson's words to the possibilities of democracy. Epistles. Articles or essays written in the form of letters, epistles represented a fairly common and popular literary genre in 18th century Europe and America. Republicanism. The cornerstone of American democracy, republicanism or the government by the public was always affirmed as the justification of the United States of America since its founding in the 1770s. The world at large was still accustomed to the rule of monarchs and aristocrats since the American War of Independence it had scooped at Americans and their republican experiment. The people, it had been said over and over again, could not govern themselves. Put them in any sort of great crisis and they will prove too ignorant to meet its challenges. All peoples needed monarchies and aristocracies and the enlightened superintendence of an oligarchy of the powerful and the wealthy to give them good government. Republicanism in America, however, received its ultimate validation when the United States managed to preserve itself as a union through the Civil War on the strength of a majority consensus on issues around which the war was fought. A philosophy or philosophies oriented towards the envisaging and realizing of a perfect social order. Some of these philosophies were very popular in 18th and 19th century Europe and America. A movement for the abrogation of the institution of slavery, whereby from the 17th century onwards men, women and children from Africa had been systematically imported to the United States of America and some of the Latin American countries and made to live and work as chattel slaves mainly on cotton, rice and tobacco plantations. The abolitionist movement, though initiated in 1790s with the convention for promoting the abolition of slavery, actually picked up momentum only by 1830s. In 1831, William Lloyd Garrison, a 26 years old newspaperman from New England who ran an abolitionist journal called The Liberator, helped to form the New England Anti-Slavery Society, which in 1933 expanded into a national anti-slavery society. This organization articulated the agenda of abolitionism: free the slaves now. From then on, it was no holds barred abolitionism till the slaves were actually freed in 1865. A religious faith closely linked to the 18th century Enlightenment enthusiasm for reason and science, as well as the growing humanitarianism of the 19th century. Unitarianism was a reaction to the excess of Puritanism. Its name came from Unitarianism's central belief that the concept of the Trinity, God in three persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, does not stand to critical examination. God to Unitarians is a single person, Christ. While divinely inspired, was merely a human being charged by God to teach humanity the message of love. Beyond that, God has left human beings entirely on their own. His spirit does not move about here on earth, entering people's soul and doing mighty things in the world. Human beings, the Unitarians believed, are fundamentally reformable. Enlighten them with science and reason, and they will gradually rise in goodness and greatness. This was the core of the theology preached by William Ellery Channing, a quiet New England clergyman who by the mid 1820s had emerged as the spiritual leader of the Unitarians. People who later become leading literary figures: Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry Wordsworth, Longfellow, Oliver Wendell Holmes and others came under Channing's influence. From him they learned that their task in life was to serve other members of society who needed their service. Among such New Englanders, Unitarians inspired reform movements that attacked slavery, worked for the spread of free public schools to the common people, and promoted the idea of peace between nations. A partly intellectual and partly activist movement emanating out of the work of Ralph Waldo Emerson, America's poet, preached from the mind 1830s to Civil War. Emerson's teaching centered around the message of personal salvation in an age of dehumanizing commodification of human identities and relationships, the cultivation of selfhood. We must develop a serene and steady self-reliance, finding our guiding values within our souls. A healthy society evolves out of the soulfulness of individuals rather than out of the sustainability of institutions. What made this almost anarchy worldview valid in Emerson's mind? The oversoul, another name for God, he said, dwells in each person, and we may rely upon its guidance. The soul that we sense within as in us in fragment of this oversoul, which is after all the transcendent reality. The world surrounding us, that is nature, constantly and consistently provides us with intimations of this reality. The most spectacular of Emerson's followers, younger people who called themselves transcendentalists, idolized their master and took his home in Concord, Massachusetts as their source of inspiration. They formed communes such as Brook Farm and Fruit Flats, dedicated to demonstrating that a purely competitive and consumerist lifestyle could be cast aside. In a truly loving community, all could share equally, labor equally, exist equally, make decisions without anyone being in authority, and user in the perfect society of brotherhood and sisterhood. In these communities, the corruption of modern society and its oppressive institution would be replaced by completely voluntarist and egalitarian way of life. Nevertheless, despite the best intentions of their promoters, these communities did not last long. The very freedom of will and action which they offered to the members in restraints of any kind was regarded as being inimical to the integrity of individuals, made communitarian living impractical and ultimately impossible. Then Neoplatonism. Okay, so this is Neoplatonism. So this is all transcendentalism. Then it is Neoplatonism. A philosophy or philosophies deriving from Plato's notion, the objects of our material world are all illusory, being reflections of ideal objects in a transcendent non-material world. So here it is the questions. Examine the role of the Federalist Papers and of the Bill of Rights in the making of the Constitution of the United States in its final shape. Comment on the general character of the letters of the early American Republic. What were the essential aspects of the transcendentalist school of writing? Do Emerson, Thoreau and Whitman necessarily inhabit the same literary tradition? Then suggested reading. Here is the Richard Rowland and Malcolm Bradbury, From Puritanism to Postmodernism, or the History of American Literature 1991. Van Wyck Brooks, The Flaring of New England 1815 to 1865. F.O. Matheson, American Renaissance. David S. Reynolds, Beneath the American Renaissance. Lawrence Buell, Literary Transcendentalism. Okay, this is all about Unit 2. Okay, here it is all about Unit 2 of the Revolutionary Prose of America. Here it is the American prose in the period of national consolidation. Okay, so Unit 2 already I have discussed in brief. You can note down all the points and you can listen all the wordings of American prose in the period of national consolidation. In night also you can listen all these chapters, and you will memorize all these things and write down in your exam. So best of luck, all the best for your upcoming exam, and please like, share and subscribe Study with Master Notes, so you will get all my notification by pushing the bell icon. So thank you viewers.